Britain's police fleets in the 1990s ran on committee decisions and tight budgets. Some of what they got should have stayed on the shortlist. Stay for number 2. It was rushed into service before it was ready. If lists like this are your thing, hit subscribe before we start. This is the countdown. Number 10, Austin Maestro 2.0 FE, 1990. A stopgap that outstayed its welcome by nearly a decade. The Austin Maestro 2.0 FE entered limited police service in 1990 from the Rover Group's Cowley plant, pressed into area car duty by forces still running down older Marina and ITAL-based fleets that had reached the end of their practical service life. Its 2.0-liter O-Series 4-cylinder engine, fuel-injected for this application, produced 115 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 115 miles per hour. The Maestro had launched in 1983 and was already 7 years old by the time forces began fitting it out with the blue lights and radio racks that turned an ordinary hatchback into an area car. Its interior plastics and switchgear reflected early 1980s British Leyland cost control, hard, grey, and unapologetically functional, and officers who had driven the Ford Sierras it was meant to supplement noticed the difference immediately, both in refinement and in how the car aged under constant use. Procurement officers defended the choice on cost grounds alone. The Maestro was cheap to buy, cheap to run, and available in numbers that newer designs simply couldn't match on short notice. For a force trying to stretch a fixed annual vehicle budget across dozens of stations, that argument was difficult to refuse, whatever the officers actually driving the car thought of it. The unexpected fact, the Maestro's dashboard-mounted talking instrument system, a novelty feature carried over from its civilian launch, remained wired into several police spec cars and would announce low fuel or an open door mid-pursuit, a distraction that at least 2 forces specifically asked Austin Rover to disable. Engineers eventually issued a bulletin describing how to disconnect the module in the field, a fix that some workshops applied and others, working through a backlog of more urgent repairs, never got around to. Officers in at least one division reportedly nicknamed the feature the passenger, on the grounds that it talked more than most actual passengers did, and rarely said anything useful. A car built to reassure 1983 buyers that the future had arrived was, by 1990, narrating its own obsolescence to officers who had no time to listen. Withdrawn from most fleets by 1994, the Maestro filled a gap. It did not fill it quietly, and it did not fill it for long. By the time the last examples left service, most forces had already moved on to newer designs that never needed a bulletin explaining how to make them stop talking, and the Maestro's brief police career quietly became a footnote in a decade that had considerably bigger disappointments still to come. Number 9, Rover Metro GTI, 1991. A hot hatch asked to do a traffic car's job, and it showed. The Rover Metro GTI joined a handful of urban policing trials in 1991 from Rover's Longbridge plant, adopted by 2 metropolitan forces as a lightweight response vehicle for congested city centers where larger cars struggled to make progress through traffic. Its 1.4-liter K-series engine produced 103 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 115 miles per hour. The GTI's compact dimensions made it genuinely useful in the narrow streets and one-way systems where larger patrol cars struggled, and its performance figures on paper were respectable for the class, quick enough off the line to keep pace with city traffic and nimble enough to thread through gaps that would have stopped a Sierra or Cavalier. Officers who trialed the car in its first weeks praised its responsiveness and its unusually tight turning circle, both genuinely useful qualities for the stop-start reality of inner-city patrol work, where 3-point turns in narrow residential streets were a routine part of the shift rather than an occasional inconvenience. The unexpected fact, the Metro GTI's boot capacity, already modest for civilian use, could not accommodate a standard police first response equipment kit without removing the rear parcel shelf entirely, meaning officers routinely drove with cones, signage, and medical equipment stacked loose behind the rear seats. On more than one occasion, that loose equipment became a hazard in its own right during hard braking, something noted in at least one force's post-trial safety report, which recommended against further procurement of the model in this configuration. A car chosen for its agility was compromised by a boot that couldn't carry what the job required. The trial was not extended beyond its initial period, and neither force placed a repeat order. What makes the Metro GTI's failure particularly frustrating, in hindsight, is how narrowly avoidable it was. A slightly larger boot, or a purpose-built storage rack, might have kept the car in service for years. Instead, the trial ended over a packaging problem rather than anything mechanical. In our view, the Metro GTI was the right idea, sized for a job that policing in the 1990s had not yet shrunk to fit, and perhaps never would, at least not until far smaller electric patrol vehicles began appearing decades later. Number 8. Vauxhall Astra MK3 GSI, 1992. Modern styling, careful accounting, and a car that felt like both at once. The Vauxhall Astra MK3 GSI entered police fleets in 1992 from Vauxhall's Ellesmere Port and Luton plants, taken on by several county forces as a mid-range response vehicle to replace aging Cavaliers on lighter duties where a full-size saloon was more car than the job required. Its 2.0-liter 16-valve engine produced 150 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 134 miles per hour. The GSI's performance figures were genuinely competitive against anything else in its class, and its rounded, aerodynamic bodywork represented a real step forward from the boxier Astras it replaced, a visual signal that Vauxhall intended for the public to associate with modern, capable policing. Fuel economy was also notably better than the Cavaliers it supplemented, a detail that mattered considerably to procurement departments working within fixed annual budgets, and several forces cited fuel savings explicitly in the paperwork justifying the switch. The unexpected fact: procurement records show the police-spec Astras were ordered with a base trim interior package rather than the GSI's standard cloth and trim upgrade, a cost-saving substitution that left the cars with the performance of the flagship model and the cabin comfort of the entry-level version, something officers on long shifts noticed within weeks. Seat bolsters wore through faster than expected under the extended hours of patrol use, and several forces later paid to have replacement upholstery fitted, largely erasing the initial saving. One workshop manager reportedly calculated that the cost of the mid-service reupholstery, spread across the fleet, came close to matching what the trim upgrade would have cost at the point of purchase in the first place. A quick car specified like a slow one. Vauxhall built the GSI to feel special. The procurement department built the order to feel ordinary. The Astra did the job asked of it. It simply never felt like the car its badge, and its performance figures, promised the officers driving it, and more than one traffic sergeant was quoted, informally, comparing the interior unfavorably to fleet cars costing considerably less. The lesson, largely unlearned at the time, was that a saving on paper isn't always a saving once a car has spent 3 years on permanent patrol. Number 7. Ford Sierra Sapphire 2.0, 1993. A reputation problem the engineers didn't create and couldn't entirely fix. The Ford Sierra Sapphire 2.0 continued in widespread police use into 1993 from Ford's Dagenham operation, the 4-door saloon variant favored by traffic divisions over the original Sierra's hatchback body, which many officers felt looked less authoritative parked outside a courthouse or on a motorway hard shoulder. Its 2.0-liter DOHC engine produced 148 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 126 miles per hour. The Sapphire's saloon boot and conventional styling had been specifically developed to address complaints about the original Sierra's jelly mold shape, a design so controversial at its 1982 launch that it reportedly affected sales for years afterward and became something of a cautionary tale within Ford's own design department. Traffic officers generally rated its cabin and controls well, describing the driving position and instrument layout as among the most sensible of any car in the fleet at the time, a small but genuine point of pride for a model that had spent much of its early life fighting its predecessor's reputation rather than its own. The unexpected fact: the Sierra range as a whole was subject to a manufacturer recall in the early 1990s addressing rear suspension geometry that, under hard cornering at speed, could produce sudden oversteer, a characteristic that several police driving schools had already flagged internally and adjusted pursuit training to compensate for before the recall was issued. Instructors reportedly built specific low-speed cornering drills around the car's known behavior, effectively training officers to manage a fault the manufacturer had not yet formally acknowledged, an arrangement that worked, but only because the instructors involved had noticed a pattern that should, by rights, have been caught on a factory test track years earlier. Officers had been driving around a known handling flaw for longer than Ford had been willing to admit one existed. The Sapphire itself was a solid, well-equipped car by the standards of its era, and many officers who drove it through to retirement spoke of it with genuine, if slightly qualified, affection. It inherited a reputation its own revisions couldn't fully outrun, and some forces continued to treat the model with a caution its improved suspension no longer strictly warranted, a hangover of trust that outlasted the mechanical problem itself by several years. Number 6. Peugeot 4053, 1994. A genuinely good car, undone by a supply chain nobody had thought to test. The Peugeot 4053 entered service with a small number of forces in 1994, an unusual continental choice imported through Peugeot's Coventry-based UK operation for forces experimenting with alternatives to the traditional Ford Vauxhall Rover procurement cycle that had dominated fleet purchasing for decades. Its 2.0-liter 16-valve engine produced 155 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 132 miles per hour. The 405's chassis was well regarded by the motoring press throughout its production run, consistently praised for ride quality and composure that domestic rivals struggled to match on Britain's uneven B-roads, and the SRI's performance and handling genuinely impressed the traffic officers who trialed it, several of whom rated it their preferred motorway car in informal post-shift feedback collected by at least one force during the trial period. The car's continental pedigree, so often treated with suspicion by fleet buyers of the era, turned out in this case to be its single strongest selling point on the road. The unexpected fact, because so few UK garages stocked Peugeot-specific police modification parts, radio mounts, light bar wiring looms, and reinforced door cards had to be sourced from a single specialist supplier in Coventry, and a fire at that supplier's premises in 1995 left two forces without replacement parts for damaged vehicles for over 4 months. Cars involved in minor collisions during that period sat off the road far longer than an equivalent Cavalier or Sierra would have, simply for want of a wiring loom that no domestic supplier could quickly replicate, tying up vehicles that would ordinarily have been back on patrol within a fortnight. A car let down not by its engineering but by its infrastructure. The forces that ran it liked driving it. The forces that had to repair it learned to regret the choice, and by 1997 most had quietly reverted to domestic manufacturers whose parts networks could actually keep pace with a working fleet. It stands as perhaps the clearest example on this list of a car that failed for reasons having nothing to do with the car itself, and everything to do with the ecosystem it was dropped into without adequate preparation. Number 5. Rover 216 GTI, 1995. A badge doing work the platform underneath couldn't fully support. The Rover 216 GTI joined several forces' lighter patrol fleets in 1995 from Rover's Longbridge plant, built on the Honda Civic-derived platform that underpinned Rover's mid-1990s range following the company's partnership with Honda, a collaboration widely credited with dragging Rover's reliability reputation back toward respectability after a difficult decade. Its 1.6-liter 16-valve VTEC engine, licensed from Honda, produced 111 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 121 miles per hour. The Honda-derived mechanicals gave the 216 genuine reliability advantages over pure Rover designs of the same era, and the VTEC engine's performance was well regarded, offering a noticeably sharper power delivery at higher revs than officers were used to from equivalent capacity British engines. Fuel economy on lighter patrol duties was also a consistent point in the car's favor, and workshop staff generally reported fewer unscheduled repairs across the 216's service life than they had come to expect from earlier Rover models of a similar size. The unexpected fact, because the 216's body shell and interior were designed and tooled almost entirely by Honda for the Japanese domestic market Civic, several standard UK police equipment fittings, particularly roof-mounted light bars, required custom bracket fabrication that Rover had not anticipated when offering the model for police tender, adding unbudgeted cost and delay to every order. What should have been a straightforward fitting-out process at a contracted conversion specialist instead required bespoke engineering on a car-by-car basis, and at least one conversion company reportedly had to hire an additional fabricator specifically to keep pace with the backlog of 216's awaiting light bars. A car that was mechanically honest and administratively difficult. The reliability the Honda partnership promised was real, and forces that persevered with the model generally reported fewer mechanical breakdowns than with comparable Rover-only designs of the previous generation. The fitting-out process, however, was not something either company had designed for, and buyers who paid for a Rover received, underneath, a car Rover hadn't fully planned to turn into a police vehicle when the original tooling agreement with Honda was signed. Number 4. Vauxhall Cavalier MK3, 1996. The backbone of British policing, and a backbone with a wiring problem. The Vauxhall Cavalier MK3 remained the most widely used traffic and response car in Britain through 1996, produced at Vauxhall's Luton plant and adopted by more forces than any other single model of the decade, a position it had held for the better part of 10 years by the time this generation reached the end of its service life. Its 2.0-liter 16-valve engine produced 148 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 130 miles per hour. The Cavalier's reputation for durability and its enormous parts availability made it the default choice for procurement departments working within tight budgets, and by the mid-1990s most forces had standardized significant portions of their fleets around it, a decision that made training, maintenance, and spares management considerably simpler across an entire region. Mechanics could often source a replacement part from a neighboring force's stores within hours, an advantage that, on paper, made the Cavalier look like the safest procurement decision a fleet manager could make. The unexpected fact: the Cavalier's factory wiring loom, designed for civilian electrical loads, was not rated for the combined draw of a full police spec fit-out, light bar, radio, mobile data terminal, and siren, running simultaneously, and several forces recorded recurring loom failures that specialist auto electricians attributed directly to sustained overload rather than manufacturing defects. Some workshops began fitting supplementary relay systems and auxiliary fuse boxes as standard practice on new deliveries, effectively re-engineering part of the car's electrics before it ever went on the road, a workaround so widely adopted that it eventually became standard procedure rather than an exception. A car built to be reliable was made unreliable by the equipment bolted onto it. The Cavalier itself, mechanically, was sound, arguably the most dependable engine and gearbox combination on this entire list, and its reputation among officers for straightforward, unglamorous durability was, in the main, well earned. What British policing asked it to carry, electrically, was more than Vauxhall had designed the standard loom for, and the fixes came from workshops, not from the factory, a quiet, largely unrecognized piece of engineering improvisation that kept thousands of Cavaliers on the road for years longer than their wiring diagrams ever anticipated. Number 3. Ford Escort RS 2000 Pursuit, 1993. A pursuit car built for speed that couldn't survive the pursuit. The Ford Escort RS 2000 entered specialist pursuit fleets in 1993 from Ford's Halewood plant, adopted by motorway patrol units seeking a faster interceptor than the standard Escort could provide, at a time when performance saloons and hot hatches on Britain's motorways were becoming noticeably quicker than the police cars meant to catch them. Its 2.0-liter DOHC engine produced 148 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 128 miles per hour. The RS 2000's performance credentials were genuine, and its acceleration figures made it a credible match for the performance cars increasingly appearing on Britain's motorways, closing the gap that had opened between police vehicles and the fastest civilian traffic during the previous decade. Early trial feedback from pursuit officers was enthusiastic, focused almost entirely on the car's straight-line speed and its willingness to rev, with more than one officer describing it, informally, as the most fun car they'd been issued in years. The unexpected fact: the RS 2000's brake system, adequate for spirited civilian driving, was not upgraded for police pursuit use, and sustained high-speed motorway pursuits produced brake fade significantly earlier than officers experienced in the heavier, more thoroughly cooled Sierra and Cavalier interceptors it was meant to complement. A limitation documented in at least one force's internal pursuit review following an incident in which a pursuing officer reported a noticeably soft pedal. After several miles of sustained high-speed running, a detail that, once logged, prompted a wider review of the model's suitability for extended pursuit work rather than short bursts of acceleration. A car fast enough to catch what it was chasing and undersupplied in the one system that mattered most once it had. Ford's road car engineers had built genuine speed into the RS 2000. Nobody had specifically re-engineered the car to stop from that speed, repeatedly, under sustained pressure, in the way a dedicated pursuit specification would have demanded, and the gap between what the car could do and what it could safely be asked to do repeatedly became the defining flaw of its short pursuit career. Most units withdrew the RS 2000 from frontline pursuit duty within 3 years, redeploying surviving examples to less demanding roles where their brakes were rarely tested to the same limit. Number 2, Rover 600, 1994. Was rushed. Rover needed an answer to the Cavalier and the Mondeo at the same time, and it needed it fast. The Rover 600 launched into police tender trials in 1994 from Rover's Cowley plant, developed jointly with Honda on a shortened timeline after Rover's product planners recognized, later than their competitors, that the mid-size executive segment was moving decisively toward the newly launched Ford Mondeo and away from the aging Rover 800 series, which had never been intended to compete directly in that space. Its 2.0-liter 16-valve engine produced 134 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 126 miles per hour. The 600's Honda-derived platform gave it a genuinely strong chassis, sharing significant engineering with the well-regarded Honda Accord of the same period, and the joint development promised the reliability that Rover badly needed after a difficult decade of uneven quality control that had, by the early 1990s, become something of a national joke among motoring journalists. Early press reviews were cautiously positive about the car's dynamics and refinement, with several road testers noting it drove noticeably better than its badge and price point might have suggested, and procurement officers were initially encouraged by the prospect of Honda-grade dependability wearing a British nameplate, a combination that seemed, on paper, to solve two problems at once. The unexpected fact: internal Rover documentation from the period shows the 600's UK-specific tooling and interior trim finalization was compressed into roughly half the development window Honda typically allotted for a comparable model, a schedule driven by the urgent commercial need to have a Mondeo competitor on sale before Ford's model gained further ground in both private and fleet markets. Several early-build 600s reaching police fleets exhibited trim rattles, panel fit inconsistencies, and dashboard component failures that later production runs, benefiting from a full year of quiet retooling and quality corrections, did not repeat to anywhere near the same degree, a discrepancy stark enough that some workshop staff reportedly began checking a car's build date before diagnosing certain recurring faults, on the assumption that anything from the first production year was simply more likely to need attention. A genuinely good car underneath, delivered before Rover had finished building it properly. The engineering was sound, the platform was proven, and the partnership with Honda was real. The timeline, driven by commercial anxiety rather than engineering readiness, was not. Forces that ordered from the first year of production spent more time in dealer workshops chasing rattles and minor faults than forces that waited 12 months and received essentially the same car, properly finished, at essentially the same price. Rushing a launch doesn't change what a car is fundamentally capable of. It changes what condition it arrives in on the day it's handed over. And for many of the officers who drove those first-year cars, that was the only impression that ever stuck, regardless of how well the model behaved once the early problems had been quietly engineered out of it. Number 1, Rover 800, 1992. The flagship that was supposed to prove British executive engineering had caught up. It proved the opposite. The Rover 800 remained in service as the primary traffic and motorway patrol vehicle for several forces into the mid-1990s, produced at Rover's Cowley plant as the company's Honda-collaborated flagship saloon, intended to compete directly with Ford's Granada and imported executive cars from Germany and Sweden that British manufacturers had been steadily losing ground to throughout the 1980s. Its 2.7-liter V6 engine, developed with Honda, produced 173 brake horsepower. Road tests recorded a top speed of around 137 miles per hour. The 800 specification was genuinely impressive on paper. A smooth, refined V6, anti-lock brakes as standard equipment at a time when many rivals still charged extra for it, and a level of equipment and cabin refinement that matched or exceeded its European rivals, all wrapped in styling meant to signal, both to the public and to Rover's own workforce, that British executive car building had rejoined the front rank after a long period of decline. For a car meant to carry the weight of national motoring pride, quite literally in the case of the traffic units that drove it in front of the public every day, the ambition behind it was entirely sincere, and the early sales brochures made no secret of the point. The unexpected fact: the Rover 800's build quality, specifically panel fit, paint consistency, and electrical reliability, was so inconsistent in early production years that Honda reportedly required Rover to rework significant portions of the Cowley assembly process before agreeing to badge engineer a shared Honda Legend variant from the same platform, a rare instance of a joint venture partner publicly withholding confidence in the lead manufacturer's own factory floor rather than in its engineering. The scrutiny reportedly extended to individual assembly stations, with Honda representatives present during production runs to observe and document inconsistencies that quality control at Cowley had not been catching on its own, a level of external oversight that, however necessary, said a great deal about how far the trust between the two partners still had to travel before either company was fully comfortable putting its badge on the other's work. A car whose Japanese design partner trusted the engineering enough to share the platform, and trusted the British factory building it so little that it demanded changes before its own name went on the same metal. Officers who drove the 800 on motorway patrol reported genuine appreciation for its performance, comfort, and presence at the roadside, alongside a steady stream of electrical faults, door seal failures, and dashboard warning lights that meant nothing was actually wrong but still had to be checked every time. A small but constant drain on the attention of officers who had considerably more urgent things to be watching for on a motorway. The 800 was withdrawn from frontline traffic duty faster than its specification sheet suggested it should have been, replaced in many fleets by the very Mondeo and Cavalier rivals it had been designed to outclass. In our view, the Rover 800 is the most disappointing British police car of the 1990s, not because the engineering failed, but because the engineering succeeded and the factory floor let it down anyway. A flagship is supposed to prove a point. The 800 proved a different one, and a more uncomfortable one for everyone involved. That Britain in the early 1990s could still design a genuinely competitive executive car on paper, and still could not always be trusted to build it to that same standard once the drawings left the design office and reached the factory floor where the actual cars, warts and all, were assembled. The 1990s asked British manufacturers to modernize their entire product range while their police customers demanded reliability, affordability, and enough performance to catch cars built by companies that had modernized a decade earlier. Some of what reached the fleets on this list was compromised by budget, cars specified down to a price rather than up to a job. Some was compromised by haste, launched before the factory or the supply chain was genuinely ready to support it. Some was simply asked to do work its original designers had never imagined when they first sketched it for a very different kind of buyer entirely. That is not a condemnation of the officers who drove these cars through long shifts in all weathers, or of the engineers who built them under commercial and financial constraints they didn't choose and often couldn't control. Procurement departments were working with fixed budgets against manufacturers racing each other on shortened timelines, and the cars in the middle of that arrangement were rarely given the chance to be simply good. They were asked to be good, fast, and cheap, usually all at once, and something in that equation almost always gave way first, whether that was the trim quality, the wiring, the brakes, or, in the case of the flagship at number 1, the factory's own quality control standing in the way of the very reputation the car was built to restore. It is simply what the decade demanded, and in most cases, what it got fell somewhat short of what it actually needed on the road. By the time the decade closed, most of these models had been quietly replaced by newer designs, some genuinely improved, some simply new enough that their particular compromises hadn't yet been discovered by the officers driving them. That, in its own way, is the real pattern running through this entire list. Not a single decade of bad decisions, but a continuous cycle of good intentions arriving slightly ahead of the resources needed to see them through properly. Repeated model after model, procurement cycle after procurement cycle, almost without anyone involved ever quite learning the lesson in time to apply it to the next one. It's worth remembering, too, that every car on this list did, eventually, do its job. None of them failed outright. None of them left a force without a working fleet. Their disappointments were, almost without exception, disappointments of degree rather than of outright failure: a boot too small, a wiring loom too light, a factory not quite ready, a supply chain not quite built for the car it was supporting. That is, in a strange way, a more honest kind of story than a simple list of failures would be. These were largely capable cars, asked to do slightly more than their specification, their timeline, or their supporting infrastructure could comfortably deliver, and the gap between capability and circumstance is where every entry on this list actually lives. Which of these surprised you most? Did you expect the Rover 800 to top the list, or did you think the Cavalier's wiring problems deserved the number 1 spot? And do you think the Rover 600 deserved its rushed reputation, or was it simply a good car released a year too early, penalized for a decision made in a boardroom rather than a design studio? Let us know which of these you remember from the road, whether you were behind the wheel, in the passenger seat, or simply watching one go past with the lights on. Tell us below.